A bit of politics now as we welcome our Professor of Politics from the University of Newcastle, Jim Jose, who has been having a look at the referendum. And we're not going to jump into so much about which way people should vote, that's up to them. But a lot of interesting technicalities, Jim, around how referendums actually work, considering we've got one in a couple of weeks. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, Mark. And I guess this was prompted by the way in which residents, citizens of the Northern Territory in particular, were revealed, in inverted commas, as having less of a voting power, shall we say, than someone, say, living in South Australia or Queensland. And in a sense, that's sort of true, because with the double majority, the second half of that process is the majority of states.
Yeah, because for something to change, for a yes to happen, you need a majority of states in numbers, but also a majority of the population overall. One of those does actually exclude the NT and, of course, the ACT.
Yes, and the thing that piqued my interest in this was hearing it presented by various, shall we say, protagonists, as if this was somehow a deliberate attempt to disenfranchise Indigenous voters in the Northern Territory, because Northern Territory votes won't count towards a state because they're not a state, and hence they're effectively being disenfranchised because they're not having a say in the very thing that is going to have an impact on their lives at some future point. So I began thinking about, we need to understand the technicality that's involved here. The first is that there were no territories in 1901. When the Constitution was fully ratified and the nation state of Australia came into being, the Northern Territory was officially part of South Australia. The ACT was officially part of New South Wales.
The second one I get. The first one kind of is weird. South Australia, when we're talking about some of the most northern parts of the country. Was South Australia called something else?
No, it was South Australia.
Okay.
And
dumb name then for them.
At the time, because I guess in the colonial times there was an issue about who was going to take responsibility on federation for the Northern Territory. And pretty quickly the South Australian government, after, in their view, being lumbered with it, persuaded the Commonwealth to give the territory its own special status as a territory, and they ceased to have responsibility for it, which meant they ceased to have financial responsibility. So let me come back, though, Mark, to the disenfranchising perspective. In 1901 or 1902, all Indigenous people who did have the right to vote, and they were people residing in South Australia and what was then the northern part of South Australia, had the right to vote because that state gave them the right. When the Franchise Act was passed in 1902, I think, its objective was to disenfranchise Indigenous voters. And there was absolutely no dissent, or very, very little dissent within the then federal parliament. It was a near unanimous type process. So up until 1962, Indigenous people in the Northern Territory had already been disenfranchised. It was the Menzies government that enabled them to get enabled Indigenous people across Australia to get the vote. The issue around the referendum, though, it still meant that it's a territory, and so like settler Australians in the Northern Territory, Indigenous Australians were equally disenfranchised.
So if we look at that, because there's been a whole bunch of referendums through time and the similar question argument could be made, more broadly, fast forwarding a little bit, why aren't they states? I mean, but the Northern Territory in particular, you could probably make a point that the ACT is set up to be a little bit different to run the Canberra machine, but more broadly, why can't we have them as states?
Well, it's a big question. It's
a big parcel of land.
If the territory was to become a state, there's about 160,000 people living in the territory. They'd be entitled, as a state, to 12 senators. That's one big thing.
So the thought is they could be overrepresented per capita proportionally.
In part. Now, the principle at federation for the states to have an equal number of senators was to ensure that the smaller states weren't overrun by the two big, what were then the two big colonies of New South Wales and Victoria. So the Senate was set up in such a way that these two big, most populated states would be able to ride roughshod over the smaller states. And to some extent, that's probably been a good thing, but it's also been a bit of a brake, shall we say, a bit of a handbrake on the way in which some decisions get to happen, because the smaller states wield power out of proportion to their population. So the Northern Territory, if it was to become a state, would have significant power in the Senate compared to, say, the ACT, which only has two. The other thing is that if you're going to make the Northern Territory a state, why not confer the rights of statehood on the Australian Capital Territory? It has 460,000, 470,000 people, almost as big as Tasmania. Tasmania only has just over, it's about 570 million people in Tasmania.
The one that I'm thinking of here is, considering the size of it geographically, how many folks live in Western Australia?
Good question.
Yeah.
I don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah, I know Perth's the one thing that's
million.
getting... Okay, I know Perth's obviously the joint that's obviously propping it up number-wise, but yeah, you would have thought that there's not a great deal of folks there either, again, compared to the eastern part of the nation.
Yeah, I mean, geographically it's a large state,
Yeah.
but in terms of population, it is not that huge.
Yeah.
And ditto South Australia.
Yeah.
I mean, the bulk of Australians live on the east coast.
Well, that's the point. See, the others like West and South, they sort of, their states, and then you've sort of got Northern Territory. I mean, granted, it's a really low population compared to even the mid-sized ones too.
But to come back to the referendum, the votes in the Northern Territory and the votes in the Australian Capital Territory will count towards the national tally, and that only happened after 1977, right? So for 77 years of our federation, the areas known as Northern Territory and Australian Capital Territory between 1911 and 1977 were, in effect, excluded from having any say at all.
That's a bit rough, isn't it? You're going to be you're going to have to live with the outcome, and you don't get to put a yes or a no in a box.
Yes. So, but none of this was sort of designed. And we come back to the point that neither of these two territories existed at federation. Now, no one has thought, or if they have, no one has wanted to act on it, once they became disconnected from the states, that there was going to be a problem in terms of referenda. So that hasn't yet really been addressed. There are ways in which it might be addressed. For example, making them states. But as we just canvassed, there's a few issues there that people in other parts of Australia might wonder why 146,000 people, 150,000, whatever it is, in the Northern Territory get to have 12 senators, etc.
Yeah, when it's less than the size of Newcastle.
Yes.
At the Hunter, yeah, we've got more people in this area. Yeah,
I mean, there are other arguments that have been put up why there are other parts of Australia, like the Northern Rivers, Northern Queensland, that have put their hands up to try and rally around a cause of becoming a state.
I feel the northern New South Wales is everything north of the Hawkesbury is a different state again. Are we going down that road?
There have been moves that for parts of states to break off to become their own state, but conferring statehood is an administrative, if you like, a parliamentary issue at the Commonwealth level. The Commonwealth exercises power over the legislatures in both of those areas. They can override any legislation that's passed in those vicinities. Another way of doing it might be to alter the Constitution in such a way that it includes the territories in the process, so that you might say, okay, you need a majority of states and territories. So in which case it will be, I think we'll be up to 8 in total. So you would need a majority. You need 5 of the states and territories to carry the plus a majority at the national level. So it's possible to do that, but that's another constitutional change which would take a bit of thinking through, and it would require a bipartisan and a genuine effort across the political spectrum to improve the Constitution. what's currently happening with this referendum, Mark, doesn't give me much optimism that in the current political climate of the post-truth environment and the sort of Trumpian, I know you've got a special soft spot there, but that the idea that, it's about winner take all. We don't care about who gets, mangled up in the process so long as we end up on top. Until we actually move away from that and start thinking about what is for the common good rather than what's for me and me mates, then, we might be able to think about another constitutional amendment which will enable people living in the territories to have a say in both senses, in both phases of the referendum process.
And for what it's worth, I'm halfway between Conservative and Libertarian, but you kind of knew that anyway, Jim. We're out of time. I think with just one statement, I think the idea of having a change or not change to all of that, there'd be winners and losers, so everyone will probably just keep it the same. It's easier to do nothing than to do something.
Well, if you're benefiting from the status quo, you're unlikely to want to change it. However, gradually people come to realise that some changes are necessary and we need to move along in that direction. Not always easy, but again, like I said, what's in the interest of the common good rather than some special interest here or there.
All right, Jim, we're out of time. I'll leave it with you. Have a good one.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark.
Our Professor of Politics from the University of Newcastle, Dr. Jim Jose, on 2NURFM 103.7.
A broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.